I'm back with case studies about religious political rhetoric. So Salek takes us through a brief history of political religious rhetoric in the United States starting in the 1960s when he says there was an emphasis on civil religion and there was a firm separation of church and state. And this is something that John F. Kennedy had to emphasize in his bid for the presidency because he was the first Catholic nominee who was attempting to become president. And people were worried that he would defer to the Pope instead of the American people when it was time to make major decisions. So Kennedy had to frame himself as loyal to America first, and in a way that did not conflict at all with his allegiance to the Catholic Church or perhaps to the Pope. So the 1960s emphasis on civil religion said we shouldn't have an overlap between politics and religion. Political rhetoric did not frequently refer to religious or faith-based references, and instead there was an emphasis on things like individual liberty, religious and cultural pluralism, civic responsibility, and a desire for social justice. So these are things that are part of a secular religion in a way. That style's faded in recent years, but it persisted through most of the 20th century after this. So Kennedy was Catholic. His rhetoric claimed that his Catholic identity was separate from his duties as a politician, and he educated people about Catholicism. So he spoke as the stigma, as a Catholic, and of the stigma. And this is what that means. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s himself was divorced and not a particularly religious person, but he managed to appeal to the civil religion in order to assure voters who were getting increasingly invested in more of a religious tone that he was a moral person who would make moral decisions that faith-based people would support. So he used things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence as his sacred texts and persuaded people that he was for traditional family values, subtext on the more conservative and explicitly Christian end of the spectrum, without himself being a religious person. And then we get to the 21st century where we see that on the right, among conservative voters, there's increasing conflation, Salek says, or mixing up of religion and politics, particularly within rhetoric, and especially when appealing to the evangelical voting bloc on the right. So Barack Obama, as a Democrat, was able to avoid the Republican push towards more religious rhetoric, and so his brand was secular and inclusive, and that worked for Obama. Didn't work for Romney, though, because he was trying to appeal to the evangelical bloc. So Romney explicitly and throughout his political career, even before he was running for president, linked his identity as a politician with his identity as a person of faith, specifically a member of the LDS Church, although he often downplayed what his faith was, but kept returning to faith and religion as important parts of his character. So his character construction relied on the fact that he was religious, but the particular denomination that he was part of undermined that appeal to the evangelical bloc. So for Romney, religion and politics were jumbled together, conflated, and he usually covered his LDS status while saying he was all in favor of Christian values in government without drawing attention to the fact that his version of Christianity was rejected by many, and particularly evangelical Christians. For Romney and covering, I just wanted to go into what covering is a little bit more extensively. Covering is a way of saying that what you call me is true, but it is not the important thing for us to focus on. So it's downplaying something while conceding that the thing is true. Acknowledgement with a deflection. So Romney often speaks as stigma. Yes, he is Mormon. That at the time, that was an appropriate word to say. Again, that's not the most politically correct parlance anymore. So yes, he'd say, I'm a member of the LDS Church. But he never challenged the stigma. He'd say, I will not renounce my faith. Yes, that is my faith. And moving on, here's how that is consistent with the values of the more conservative branch of the Republican Party, socially conservative. So this covering technique is common throughout Romney's political career. In his Republican National Convention speech in 2012, Romney said that he supported a government with religious foundation. This speech is called Faith in America. You can look it up. He linked religion to American values, so we see this merging of religion and politics on the right. He identified as Mormon, but in the past tense. So he said, yes, I remember my childhood as a Mormon, but where you might have thought it was unusual or out of place, I never perceived it that way. So he acknowledges that his Mormon status, his LDS status, could have been perceived as out of place. So he says, I know it's a stigma, basically. He implies that he knows that. But then he said that he kept business at Bain Capital and religious practices separate, even when it could have benefited the LDS Church. So he said, I can keep these things separate and professional, and yet my faith informs my belief that American values and religion belong together. During Romney's 2012 candidacy, or his campaign, he was able to garner a little bit of support from an evangelical leader named Reverend Franklin Graham, son of Billy Graham, famous televangelist. At least I think he's his son. I need to double check that. And Graham decided that it was not his plan to openly endorse candidates, but instead to more subtly suggest that Romney is the correct person for his followers to vote for because Romney is the person of faith and Obama is not. So Graham said, Romney's a person of faith, Obama's secular or implicitly Muslim, even though that's not correct, nor should it be stigmatized, governance would be worse than Romney's not quite Christian, the way that Graham understands it, version of faith-based governance. So Graham is doing this kind of elaborate do-si-do with his rhetoric where he disavows Obama and he disavows the LDS Church while suggesting that Romney is still the person whose plans are most consistent with the values of Graham's evangelical followers. So Graham's telling his followers, vote for the candidate who lets you keep your values instead of for the candidate who shares your faith. So here Graham is saying faith and denomination are not the same thing. A person of faith is going to vote for things that are consistent with traditional family values, and a person of faith, for example, might vote against increased access to abortion, things like that. So you can have faith or be a person of faith or be a person with conservative values, socially conservative values, without being an evangelical Christian. That's the maneuver that Graham does in his speech. He implied that Romney, like other members of the Church of Latter-day Saints who were politicians, could be relied on to restore America to a faith-based form of leadership, even though they were not members of the faith that Graham recognized. And then Salek tells us that Graham's speech performed an epistemic function. So he was able to ritually absolve his followers of the fear that voting for someone who didn't share their faith was a betrayal of their faith. So this was a way of saying they can vote for Romney because he shares their values, even though he doesn't share their denomination. I'll bring it here. Thank you. There are a number of takeaways from this reading, and these are the ones that I think are most important. The first is a quotation from page 183 of Salek's article, which says, "Stigmas can be rhetorically downplayed, but at the same time support the rhetorical environment that constitutes them." So what Romney and Graham both ended up doing in their different speeches and articles was to say, yes, Mitt Romney is a member of the LDS Church, but that's not the most important thing about him in this case, even though it is a flaw with him. So neither challenged the stigma against the LDS Church, but both made some concessions and said, let's downplay that. It's not the most important thing here, even though it's recognized by both as a challenge. So stigmas can be rhetorically downplayed. Don't mind me, I'm just a vegan. But at the same time, support the rhetorical environment that constitutes them. And I know that's a flaw. It's not really a flaw. Neither being a member of the LDS Church nor being a vegan is a flaw, but this is the way that the rhetoric constructs things. So vegans and LDS people of the world, rock on. You're fine. Okay, so rhetorical situation is another takeaway that I want you to grasp from this article. The rhetorical situation, as Marty Medhurst tells us, based on Lloyd Bitzer's article, is composed of the exigence, audience, and constraints. The exigence, the reason for speaking. The audience, the particular people you need to appeal to. And the constraints, the things that get in the way. So religion can be a constraint, as can anything else that's perceived as a stigmatizing element of your character. Something else that I want you to note from this is that there are a lot of possible responses to a stigma. So when you're doing your candidate dossiers or your comparison papers, you can analyze how people respond to the hurdles that they have in terms of public perception. So you can convert, like abandon the thing that people don't like, pass, pretend you don't have the thing that people don't like, cover, acknowledge that you have the thing that people don't like, and then ask them not to pay attention to it, or challenge and educate people. So acknowledge that you have the thing that people don't like, and then explain why it is incorrect for people not to like it, but probably framing it a little bit differently than that. Another takeaway from this article is to note that religion and politics are continuing to get closer and closer for the time being in 21st century American discourse. And we can note this with Donald Trump's reliance on the evangelical bloc, the electoral advantage that he gained from choosing Mike Pence as his vice president. So the evangelical bloc is still really important among people voting on the right in the United States. And then finally, this is a little tidbit that I think could be helpful for composing your comparison papers, which are due at the end of the semester. So here is what I think Salek's rule for political communication is. And I want to note that this rule is an ideal that Salek thinks is the most ethical course of action. It's not necessarily practical advice for winning an election. So this is what Salek wants people to do. It's not necessarily the thing that will win them the seats that they're running for, and it's not necessarily the thing that we will witness the most. But Salek thinks that politicians who possess a stigmatized identity trait should educate their audiences about their identity and challenge negative stereotypes. So speak as stigma and educate about stigma. And that is Salek's article. I hope you have a nice week, and I'll see you soon.